Hello and welcome to another episode of The Writer's Block. I am Mason and I'm leading today's discussion. As you hopefully by this point know, I am joined by Cameron, Mari, Cody, and Jeff. And today we are going to be talking about Marvel's recent TV show, Moon Knight, which we have deliberated and discussed talking about for a bit. I have loved Moon Knight due to comic books for years. Mari quite enjoyed Moon Knight as well. And so just kind of in general, we were hoping to talk about it today. So friends, tell me all your deepest desires as far as this show is concerned. Let's hear everyone's thoughts. Or no one's, that's okay.
I can go first.
We can sit in silence. That's fine.
Feel free. Go
we
for
can
it.
just like stare at each other.
Viewers surely will love that.
People just listening to the video will enjoy the silence. Time to like ponder who you are.
Precisely. It's like a weird version of ASMR that makes you a little uncomfortable. Mari, you go ahead and go first.
Oh, okay. I won't do 3 minutes of breathing into the microphone. One thing that I noted when we were discussing this earlier, one thing I really enjoyed about Moon Knight was its representation of mental health. It did get quite fantastical at the end, but as I've mentioned, I have a friend who's been diagnosed with DID, and then there's often this representation split where someone with DID can become dangerous and can hurt other people. And while I don't, is this spoiler free, Mason?
No, this is, sorry. If you're watching and if for whatever reason you don't already know this, there will be spoilers in this.
I'm about to drop a big spoiler. So while the inclusion of Jake Lockley isn't my most favorite twist at the end, in general, the main character, Stephen Mark, is represented, I think, realistically as someone who is doing their best to be kind even when they don't fully understand the world. And that representation meant an awful lot to me.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Mark in the final episode delivers the line at one point to Stephen that Stephen was the only superpower he ever needed, right? Which I think there you kind of tread some ground where like maybe we're romanticizing other individuals' various psychoses a little bit there. But with what I would say is relatively few exceptions, I felt like the show did a really good job of portraying these different alters in a fairly respectful fashion in relation to DID. Cameron, it looks like you have thoughts, or you're just pawing thoughtfully at your beard. Either or is fine.
ASMR, but it's beard ASMR.
Oh, that sounds like the worst thing ever. I would not do that to anybody. The sound of my beard coarse and anyways, I'm sorry. Yes, I do have thoughts. Generally speaking, I did find myself getting a little uncomfortable throughout some of the later episodes as we got into more sort of a therapeutic setting and started to question what's really going on, what is the reality that's being presented. As someone who actually, I am not a therapist, I am not a practitioner of any sort, but I do have a PhD in psychology, and I worried for several minutes that we were straying into uncomfortable and dangerous territory with the diagnosis of DID being the source of Mark's violence, and that got me a little squicky pretty quick, but they did sort of steer themselves away from that quite successfully, and I was really glad to see that, because like Mari mentioned, we've got enough of that around already, and it isn't helping out folks who are really struggling with their lives in real life, right? To sensationalize something that really does affect real people and makes it really difficult for them to manage their day-to-day existence, and they suffer quite a bit, right?
Jeff, Cody, any thoughts from you guys?
I have some thoughts. It's going to move slightly away from the talking about the mental health aspect, but I really did want to note Oscar Isaac has some range.
Oh man.
Like, to dig on Split a little more. When I watched Split, James McAvoy has a little bit of portraying different parts, but it really just felt like sort of James McAvoy play acting as different people. They said to him, okay, we want you to pretend to be Patricia. We want you to pretend to be whatever these people are. With Oscar Isaac, the differences between Steven and Mark were very, very distinct, almost in sort of a haunting way where I'm like, look, am I really looking at the same person here? I started to feel like Steven's features were different than Mark's, just purely from a perspective standpoint. So I think Oscar Isaac knocked it out of the park on that one.
Absolutely. Some really impressive physical acting for sure.
Yeah,
Jeff?
I would agree. I mean, I would say that just that could be enough for, it to be worthwhile to watch the show. It's not like the show is a big commitment anyway. It's only 6 episodes. So, you can get in pretty quick and see what Cody's talking about. I mean, the first episode, I think still remains my favorite episode, just because of the way the action is done is so fun. I also just love Steven as a character, and it's more focused on him in that episode. And it just shows off Oscar's talent in it. And I think he does an amazing job with the role. Absolutely. I totally agree with that.
For sure.
I have many thoughts about the show, but in terms of that, I think that's a quick reaction. The other thing that I would just say to the mental health aspect is I do think it's great that they're tackling it, and we're getting to see it in a larger media that gives it more exposure. And I think, as has been said, for the most part, they were sensitive to it and presented it in a way that was positive, especially as you say that at the end it is sensationalized a bit with that line, but it is still giving it this sort of he's living with it, dealing with it, and still has it at the end. The shifting back and forth, I think, was very visually effective with the suit shifting between Mark and Steven, for instance, just as an example, and that they're both there, they're there to stay, and that I think left a nice message at the end to a degree. I think there's a lot of writing problems with the show, especially at the end. It just sort of falls apart personally. But I think it being a shorter show and there being some really good action, and I think in episode 5, there's some really good emotion between the two principal characters. They're both played by Oscar, and their sort of history together that I think is really powerful. Like with him outside, watching the funeral and all that. Like so many moments in episode 5 that I think are really great. So that's my take. Is that I think that's sort of been the case for me recently with Marvel shows, is that they'll have some really big highs and some other stuff that's like meh. So you kind of leave it going like, that was fine, that was good enough, and I'll watch something else that goes out. But those are my thoughts in a nutshell.
Yeah.
I really do feel like Marvel shoots itself in the foot so often, especially recently, as they're trying to branch out and make the Marvel brand more things to more people. You get these wonderfully weird shows like Moon Knight, like WandaVision, where they're really letting the writers and directors do some stuff that are not what you're used to seeing from Marvel. But unfortunately, in the third act, the Marvel hammer comes down, and we've got to get back to the standard superhero fare, or else they're betraying their promise, or feel that they're betraying their promise to their core fans. And that tends to be, at least for me, the least interesting part. And unfortunately, that's the end part. And it leaves, like Jeff was saying, with some ambivalent feelings, even when they started off super strong, like I feel like both Moon Knight and WandaVision did, but then sort of petered out as we have to get back to the big guns and the big explosions. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Sorry, Mason, I see that you're just like ready to talk, but a quick thing I want to throw out is Implicitly Pretentious. It's a YouTube channel. They're absolutely fantastic. But they have a really interesting perspective on the phase 4 of the MCU being all about genre experimentation and pushing the limits as much as possible, so that Marvel decides how the genre develops, as to just allowing people to get sick of watching Iron Man over and over. So just to confirm that, I also struggle with the Act 3 principle. I think it's interesting to see at least the attempts of reaching out to do something more unique. Okay, sorry, Mason.
No, you're good. All the things that I want to talk about are very different from what we're talking about right now.
Well, in
So
that case.
that's why I've been quiet. That's why I've been quiet. I will say really quick, kind of to this point, to this topic, we as a group, particularly Cody, Jeff, Cody's brother Jonah, and Cameron and I were talking earlier about a self-publishing book that won a competition recently, and Cameron was kind of commenting on the prose of the novel, how it was like less than what he would have expected from something that was a competition winner. And we kind of talked about, popular literature and how it oftentimes is not excellent from like a kind of foundational prose or punctuation or grammar perspective, right? And I think a lot of that carries over into TV and movies as well, right? A lot of what is most popular, rarely speaking, is the highest quality. And while I really enjoy Marvel TV shows, I also expect very little from them, I think. So if you're coming into this thinking to yourself, Marvel is the pinnacle of storytelling, sincerest apologies for all of us basically saying that you're wrong. But pressing forward, if we can, one other thing, this is kind of rewinding a little bit to our earlier topic about mental health, but I think one thing that the portrayal of DID and the response of so many people, particularly to those earlier episodes that are kind of more true to the experience and a little bit less sensationalized than the latter half of the season gets. I think that highlights to me something that I think is important, and something that I've tried to incorporate into my writing, which is that mental health portrayed realistically can be and generally is compelling. Oftentimes kind of looking through the history of popular fiction, whether it's Split, whether it's Psycho, right? Which like in a way is its own messed up portrayal of DID, and looking kind of to other portrayals of mental health. A lot of the time we take a very, very slim understanding of a condition that people struggle with, and then portray it in ways that we think are dramatic. My second book, Rebellion Prison Break, I've asked a number of people who their favorite character in that book is, and almost unanimously I've gotten the response that the favorite character is Ice. And those who will read that book will note that Ice suffers from anxiety. And so it's been really exciting and encouraging to me every time that someone talks to me about how much they like Ice, to hear how much that character resonates with people, particularly as someone who has had anxiety attacks in the past. It's really encouraging, really uplifting, really exciting to kind of see people latch on to that. So that was one of the things that I was just keeping within myself.
If I could jump in there, I also want to say on the note of sort of mental health representation, you've got a few different aspects. I mean, obviously Moon Knight, Oscar Isaac, but you also have Harrow as this victim of trauma and abuse at the hands of at least according to him, but obviously he deeply, deeply feels it. And I'm blanking on her name, starts with an L. Layla, yeah, okay. And Layla's trauma, having her father be killed, and have her father be killed kind of at the hands of Oscar Isaac. I mean, you have so many different, and even then also the trauma, not DID related, of Oscar Isaac and his mother and the abuse that happens there. You have a ton of representation and a breadth of discussion about trauma and what it does to people. And I really, really don't remember the last time I've seen a movie not like distinctly about trauma and about mental health do that in such a good way.
I hope this show, kind of as you were talking about, Mason, and what I would completely agree with you, Cody. Hope this show just shows that shows right, that type of storytelling can work, and that people, it resonates with individuals, so it can keep happening. Because I think what the show was shooting for is great and admirable. And did it get there on all accounts? Yeah, different people have different opinions, but I think it showcased how compelling that type of storytelling can be, and how they can resonate. And I think a big part of it is something, just to get to the writing side that you were talking about a little bit, Mason, there is, most people, I think, who've taken a writing class have heard that it's important when you're writing a character to do things from their perspective, have their take on things be unique. And I know that as a reader, that's something that I latch onto immediately. I really enjoy seeing a character who's got maybe a slightly different worldview than I do, or different experience set than I do, or very different than I do, because that's what makes it a truly new experience, because I'm getting to live in the world in a new way. Like, that's the joy of stories, right? That we get to live 1,000 lives within one life, or 1,000,000 lives, or whatever, right? And so I think with something like Anxiety with Ice, or DIZ with Moon Knight here, that you're getting that. You're getting to see, what is it like to experience these various situations that maybe I would normally experience, but have a completely different viewpoint on them because of who you are as a person and the way you physically and mentally react to things. So I think that's why it works, because it helps create the greater immersion and greater character depth.
And I would have to say, even if Moon Knight doesn't fire on all cylinders, I would sure rather see some of our mainstream action-oriented media be swinging for the fences a little bit more in this regard, and not even just in terms of representation of mental health issues, but also more broadly, just in attempts at new and different kinds of storytelling that are not the same, Captain America. No, it was the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Boy, I hated that show. Sorry to anybody who loved it. I thought it was garbage. I would
casually
rather watch
tossing that out there.
something. Yeah, I just had to throw that out there, just in case I can offend somebody with that. I would sure rather watch something that doesn't necessarily stick the landing, but is trying something weird and new and different, and doing something good with it, than same old, same old.
And this is something, going off of that maybe will transition to something Mason wanted to talk about, maybe not. So if not, you can ignore it. But when we look at the concept of the everyman, I've noticed watching Marvel movies, starting with Iron Man and then moving forward, the everyman originally was a strong, intelligent, good person who kind of may have been a bit of a jerk sometimes, but ultimately carried through and generally did things correctly. So when we look at the first phase of the MCU, we have these very strong, I'm going to say it, predominantly male characters acting in a strong, I have to save the world perspective. And then as we've been moving forward, and I almost feel like Infinity War may have been a moment, maybe the moment happened before that, we're starting to see more overtly vulnerable people, where we're seeing masculine characters who struggle with neurodiversity or mental illness, or characters who are trying to grasp with their emotions. And so it's almost like the protagonists are being seen as more human, as opposed to just always being destined to become a superhero.
Yeah.
One.
Oh, you go, Jeff.
I was going to say real good. That's one reason why I am a big fan of Iron Man 3, which I know is not one that people normally talk a great deal about, but I think Tony dealing with the trauma of what he experienced and doing it with some kids that he meets, I found that to be very compelling, because it is, all right, you're right, it's like sort of a deconstruction almost, or showing them in a more vulnerable light and getting to see an alternate side of them, making them more human. And so, yeah, that's a wonderful point.
Yeah, I think Infinity War and Endgame together kind of help create a kind of franchise moment of trauma, right? That sets a very different tone, that then has made it so that a lot of stuff since then can kind of react to things fairly differently than I think they originally did. And I think that's cool. I think that's exciting. The thing Mari was alluding to that I wanted to talk about, that I will talk about briefly, because I do believe we've been talking for a decent amount of time, is that something that's interesting to me about Moon Knight, and about some of the Disney Plus shows in general, is they kind of begin to tread in the direction of unreliable narrators, right? To the same point of Mari, where these are more vulnerable, flawed individuals, so too are the perspectives or performances that they put on for the rest of the world, are often likewise flawed. Whether it is Wanda, who is struggling with her own mental health and not entirely seeing the world through a correct or a real paradigm, maybe, to Loki, whose perspective is fundamentally deceitful, which then, from a viewer perspective, also causes kind of the question of like, what is real, what is not. And then here into Moon Knight, where as a result of Steven, who at the beginning of the show is the sole perspective, since he fundamentally lacks a great deal of understanding of his own situation, likewise, he is a pretty fundamentally flawed narrator as well. Now, of course, film, TV as a medium is very different from novels, very different from writing, right? But it is very interesting to see them kind of experimenting, I think, with something that I think maybe just works a little better in prose, since we are able to more fully inhabit the thoughts of a character instead of witnessing them from the exterior, generally speaking.
I mean, if you want to talk about the classic example, you've got Fight Club, right?
Yeah.
Which honestly does a pretty great job of it. But I do agree with you that sort of, can I really trust what I am, the perspective that I'm being given, is easier to do in prose, because we are less persuaded as humans by reading something than we are by seeing it. If you see it, it is by default reality, and then asking somebody to question that often really throws them for a loop. I watched Moon Knight with my family, and several of the members of my family were like, wait, hang on, what's actually happening right now? I don't understand where this story is going. And a lot of them lost interest in the story because they couldn't tell, they couldn't trust what they were seeing. And so it is a riskier proposition in a visual medium to try and use the unreliable narrator, even though it can be used to great effect.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, not even just I think particularly in film, but even outside of film, you run a risk of the unreliable narrator kind of becoming a gimmick a little bit. But when it plays out, regardless of what media or medium, I should say, is being utilized, it oftentimes is really impressive.
I think you're right, though, Mason, and I hadn't really thought about that fact, but when you lay it out in those shows and the way those characters are, it makes sense, and I do think it does add another dimension of the storytelling. It kind of ties to what Cameron was saying, that rather watch something that's swinging for the fences, that's got something new to say, or got some ideal that they're trying to showcase, instead of the same old. And I think an unreliable narrator is obviously one way to at least mix up the way you're doing the narration for the story. So yeah, I mean, it makes it trickier for sure, right? I mean, as has also been said, it can create problems, but it's a tool in the writer's toolbox, and I think it is being used a bit more frequently. I feel like back in the day, I'd never even heard of an unreliable narrator. I don't think it was until like I read Name of the Wind or something, and someone was like, "Oh yeah, unreliable narrator." I'm like, "What's this? What are you talking about?" It's like, "Oh, a narrator that isn't actually telling the truth." I'm like, "What? What do you mean?" It's like, that's just the way the story is. What are you talking about? So I think it's interesting. This has become more of a normal part of storytelling, to a degree, anyway.
Well, as I said, we've talked for a fair amount of time. Does anyone have any just pressing, burning thoughts that just needs to be vomited out before we conclude?
You don't want to hear about what's burning.
Okay, moving away from that. Why, and as far as I know, this wasn't answered in the show. Maybe you comic book people will let me. Why does Harrow have glass in his shoes?
Okay, so
Sorry,
really,
Mason. I think the real question is, why don't you have glass in your shoes?
I don't particularly like pain or bleeding.
sure.
It's a personal choice, but okay.
Fun fact about Arthur Harrow in the comic books, he's basically a blank slate. Like, he was effectively a non-issue before this TV show. But the general understanding that I was at was that he does that to atone for his own perceived crimes committed while he was the Fist of Khonshu.
Yeah, I'd agree. That was my take as well, and supported by what, despite my complaints of the last episode, one of my favorite parts of the last episode is when Ethan Hawke was pleasantly surprised that they did a really good job with Harrow. When Harrow talks about that he's willing to take the responsibility, willing to, if his scales don't balance, he'll take whatever judgment is there. And you very much get the feeling that he is trying to atone, because he even talks about that he hoped that all his work he had done would atone for the past. So I think it's a part of that.
Okay, that makes sense. And I really wanted to ask that because Harrow is my favorite character by far in there. I mean, Ethan Hawke, Jeff, you said that you were pleasantly surprised. I was blown away. I mean, I had a couple weeks before we started watching Midnight, I had just watched Gattaca. So first off, the age difference was
So
a little
good. But that movie's so good.
bumpy.
Sorry,
But yeah,
go ahead.
I was like, I came out of the movie, I was like, wow, Ethan Hawke did an incredible job in that. And I remember seeing Dead Poet Society going, okay, wow, Ethan Hawke used to be a really good actor. And then I watched Moon Knight, I'm like, scratch that. Ethan Hawke is a good actor. So I just wanted to get that last question asked so I didn't have to feel like there were any loose ends and I could just enjoy his performance the whole way through.
I thought his performance was incredible. And despite the confusion that I would agree happens in episode 5 of like what's real, to me that was like the real final battle that happens personally between them in the ward and everything. And I thought his speech there was just so good. So yeah, I mean I'd say to me the show is worth watching just for some of the performances, and I feel like that's what I would say about most of the Marvel TV shows recently. Like, they're just killing it with a lot of the casting that they're doing. Like, I'm crazy excited about the casting of She-Hulk, for instance, right? I just, well, I'll save the other thought. Let's see with the positive. The casting's been really great. I thought Ethan Hawke did an amazing job. I would completely agree, Cody.
I think we're gonna leave it at that, friends, because She-Hulk's been mentioned, and I just if we stay here too long, I don't know.
Wait,
what's gonna happen.
I have one more thing to point out. It's not about She-Hulk. It's not about She-Hulk.
All right, fine.
Cool level of representation in this. You have Egyptian representation. You have mental health representation. You have a Jewish representation, which I was very pleasantly surprised at. I feel like you don't see a lot of modern Jewish representation in these. So to see Oscar Isaac wearing a yarmulke and the whole family being there, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was a really big deal for me. Fun fact: Scarlet Witch is Jewish in the comic books. There have been a lot of Jewish characters whose heritage has been erased in the MCU thus far. So the fact that they did not do that with Moon Knight, I was tremendously grateful for. Particularly because it is a pretty big defining aspect of his character. So thank goodness for that. And on that, we will go ahead and conclude. Thank you, ladies, gentlemen, whoever the heck you are, for joining us on this fine day or night. We'll see you later, blockheads.